September 1994. A loading bay behind a wholesale meat processing facility on the eastern edge of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. A 1988 Ford F-250 with a rusted tailgate and a hand-painted livestock identification number stenciled above the rear wheel well has just backed into the receiving area. The driver climbs down from the cab. She is 43 years old. Her name is Lavinia Parrish. She is wearing work boots, a canvas barn jacket faded to the color of old wheat, and a wool cap pulled down over ears that are already red from the November cold. The trailer behind her truck holds 14 Black Angus steers, each averaging 1,150 pounds on the hoof, bred from a line of cattle that 3 different men in 2 different provinces had told her was genetically finished and not worth the cost of feed. The receiving manager, a man named Dale who had been buying cattle in Saskatchewan for 19 years, walks out with his clipboard. He has never dealt with a producer from the Hepburn district who did not come recommended by another producer he already knew. He had not heard of Lavinia Parrish 8 weeks earlier. The check he will hand her before she drives back is for $23,800. The largest single payment Lavinia Parrish has ever received in her life. But this story does not begin in Saskatoon. It begins 4 years earlier. It begins 4 years 90 on the autumn of 1990 on a gravel road outside of Hepburn, Saskatchewan. When Lavinia Parrish drove home alone from a cattle auction with an empty trailer and a decision that the men in her life would spend the next 4 years finding reasons to call a mistake. Lavinia was 39 years old. In the autumn of 1990, she had been separated for 7 months from her husband, a grain farmer named Gordon Aldcroft, who had operated 1,200 acres of canola and wheat north of Hepburn for 11 years before the marriage ended quietly and without much drama in the spring of that year. The separation had been Gordon's suggestion. The divorce, which was finalized in March of 1991, had given Lavinia the 80-acre parcel on the southwest corner of the Aldcroft property, a piece of land Gordon had always referred to as the back quarter, and which he considered the least productive portion of his operation because the soil was heavier clay than the rest of the farm and drained poorly in wet years. Gordon had kept the house, the machinery, and the grain quota. Don't lie. Lavinia had kept the back quarter, a 1988 Ford truck, $14,000 in savings from 11 years of bookkeeping work she had done part-time for the local co-op elevator, and a daughter named Rosalind, who was 11 years old and who had her mother's habit of watching things carefully before she said anything about them. It was a dry July. The 80-acre parcel had a problem that everyone in the Hepburn district knew about, and that Gordon had cited more than once as the reason he had never developed it. 32 of those 80 acres were heavy clay lowland that flooded in spring and stayed wet well into June in normal years, which made them useless for annual cropping under any conventional rotation. The remaining 48 acres were arable but isolated from the district's drainage tile system and costly to improve. Gordon's position, which he had held since purchasing the parcel as an addition to his original land base in 1986, was that the 80 acres were not worth the capital required to bring them into productive use, and that Lavinia, in accepting them as her divorce settlement, had taken the one piece of the farm that could not pay its own way. Lavinia did not disagree with Gordon's assessment of the land's limitations. She disagreed with his conclusion about what those limitations meant. She had walked the 80 acres alone on a Sunday morning in April of 1990, 2 weeks after Gordon had suggested the separation, 3 weeks before she had agreed to it. She had put on rubber boots and walked the wet ground of the lowland portion, which was flooded at that time of year, to a depth of 4 to 6 inches across most of its surface. She had stood in the middle of the flooded section for a long time. The water was cold and clear. The clay beneath it was firm. There was a stand of native sedge grass along the northern edge that had survived every wet year and every dry year since anyone in the district could remember. The lowland held water because it was shaped to hold water, a natural basin that the surrounding upland drained into, fed by snowmelt and a small intermittent creek from the east. It was not broken land. It was not damaged land. It was land that had been assessed by people who grew grain, and grain farmers, in Lavinia's considered opinion, were not always the right people to assess land that did not want to grow grain. Lavinia had been reading about cattle. She had been reading about it for 2 years. In fact, since a conversation at the co-op elevator in 1988 with a woman from the Rostern area named Philippa, who ran a small cow-calf operation and who had mentioned, almost in passing, that wet native lowland was not a liability for a cattle producer the way it was for a grain farmer. Native sedge and wetland grass were good summer grazing, Philippa had said, the kind of forage that Black Angus cattle, in particular, thrived on, the kind of ground that cost almost nothing to maintain because it maintained itself. Lavinia had not told Gordon about the conversation with Philippa. She had not told him about the reading. She had filed both things away in the particular way a woman files away information that she knows her husband will not receive well, which is carefully and without urgency, because the information is not going anywhere. When Gordon had suggested the separation in the spring of 1990, Lavinia had accepted the back quarter in the settlement. She had accepted it because it was the only thing on the property that she believed she knew how to turn into something. She had not told Gordon this. Gordon had assumed, and the assumption was reasonable given everything he knew, that Lavinia was taking the back quarter because it was the only thing available to her. He had not asked her what she intended to do with it. If he had asked, she would have told him. He did not ask. The morning after the divorce was finalized in March of 1991, Lavinia drove to the Hepburn post office and picked up a catalog from a registered Black Angus breeding association in Alberta. She had ordered it 6 weeks earlier. She sat in the truck in the post office parking lot and read it for 40 minutes with the engine running for heat. Rosalind was in school. The temperature outside was -18. Lavinia read the catalog carefully, and then she drove to the bank and asked to speak to the agricultural loans officer, a man named Harris Coulter, who had been lending to Hepburn area farmers for 14 years. Harris Coulter listened to Lavinia's proposal for 22 minutes without interrupting. The proposal was for a small cow-calf operation on the 80-acre parcel, beginning with 8 registered Black Angus cows and 1 bull, using the wetland portion as summer rotational grazing, and the upland portion for a small hay cut that she would supplement with purchased feed in winter. She had calculated her startup costs at approximately $18,400, including livestock, fencing, a used water system, and a small 3-sided shelter she intended to build herself over the summer. She was requesting a loan of $9,000 against the land as security. She had $14,000 in savings. Harris Coulter looked at the 80-acre parcel on the county assessment map he kept on his desk. He looked at the heavy clay designation on the lowland section. He looked at Lavinia. "Mrs. Parrish," he said, "this parcel has no existing infrastructure for livestock, and the lowland acreage has no established drainage. The assessed productivity rating for that portion of the land is the lowest classification in the county. I'm going to be honest with you. This is not a strong application." "I know what the assessment says," Lavinia said. "The assessment was done by people looking for annual crop yield. I'm not looking for annual crop yield. Harris Coulter approved a loan of $6,500, not the $9,000 she had requested, and only because the 80-acre parcel was owned free and clear and the security was sound regardless of the land's productivity rating. He told her privately, after the paperwork was signed, that he expected her to be back within 18 months asking to restructure. He did not say this to be cruel. He said it because in 14 years of agricultural lending in Hepburn, he had not seen an 80-acre parcel with that soil classification support a viable livestock operation. Lavinia thanked him. She took the check. She drove to the farm supply co-op in Rosthern and spent 3 hours choosing fencing materials. The first 8 cows arrived in May of 1991, transported in a borrowed stock trailer from an Angus producer south of Saskatoon named Ida Sorensen, who had agreed to sell Lavinia 8 two-year-old heifers from a herd she had been developing for 9 years. Ida was 61 years old. She had started her own operation on 120 acres outside Dundurn, with 11 cows and no help from anyone. She had known at a glance, when Lavinia had driven down to look at the herd in April, that the woman in the canvas barn jacket was not browsing. She had given Lavinia a price $200 per head dollars below what she would have charged a grain farmer buying cattle as a tax shelter, because she could see the difference between someone who was investing and someone who was speculating, and she had never charged the same price to both. Rosalind, who was 12 that spring, had helped Lavinia and Ida unload the heifers into the pasture on a cold Wednesday morning in May, while a late-season snow flurry moved through from the northwest. Rosalind had held the gate. She had not been told to hold the gate. She had simply seen that the gate needed holding and had gone to stand at it without being asked. Lavinia had noticed this and had said nothing about it. She noticed most things Rosalind did without commenting on them. The same way, Rosalind noticed most things her mother did without commenting on them. They had been doing this for Rosalind's entire life. It was their primary mode of communication, and it worked well for both of them. The bull came 2 weeks later, a 3-year-old registered Angus named in the breeding papers as Blackwood Endeavour III, which Lavinia did not use as a name because no one would ever call a bull that. She called him Third. Rosalind called him Third also. The name stuck. The summer of 1991 was the hardest summer. Lavinia was still working 12 hours a week at the co-op elevator to maintain her income. July, she was building the 3-sided shelter herself, with Rosalind handing materials and a retired carpenter named August from the next concession who had offered to help on Saturday mornings because he had nothing else to do on Saturday mornings and liked to be useful. August was 74. He worked slowly and correctly. The shelter was completed in August and was better than anything Lavinia could have built without him. She paid him in suppers because he had refused money and because he ate alone most evenings, and the suppers were the part of the arrangement he actually wanted. The women at the Hepburn Community Hall, where Lavinia had been attending the Agricultural Women's Network meetings since 1987, were divided in their response. 2 of them thought it was brave. 3 of them thought it was impractical.
One of them,
a woman named Sandra, who had farmed with her husband for 30 years and who had opinions about everything, told Lavinia at a meeting in June of 1991 that 80 acres was not enough land to make beef cattle work, that the margins were too tight, that she would be spending more on winter feed than she would recover at market, and that the lowland section was going to cause her problems every spring. Sandra was not wrong about the lowland section causing problems in spring. In the spring of 1992, the snowmelt came late and heavy, and the lowland flooded to a depth of nearly a foot across its entire surface for 6 weeks between late March and mid-May. Lavinia moved the cattle to the upland portion for the duration. It was crowded. The grass took a beating. She supplemented with more purchased hay than she had budgeted for, which cost her $1,500 she had not planned to spend. What Sandra had not accounted for was what happened to that lowland section by the 3rd week of June. When the water receded, it left behind a flush of native sedge grass and reed canary grass that was 3 feet tall and thick enough to make the cattle reluctant to leave it when she rotated them back in July. The growth was extraordinary. It was the kind of forage that happened on land that flooded regularly and was left alone to be what it wanted to be. Lavinia walked the lowland section alone on a Sunday morning in late June of 1992, the same way she had walked it in April of 1990. And she looked at the grass, and she understood that the spring flooding was not a problem. The spring flooding was the operation. The land was doing exactly what it had always done, and what it had always done was exactly what she needed it to do. She had kept records from the beginning. A blue hardcover notebook, purchased at the pharmacy in Hepburn in April of 1991, in which she recorded every morning the condition of the pasture, the behavior of the herd, the water consumption from the dugout she had excavated on the upland portion, the weight estimates she made by eye, and confirmed twice yearly with the scale at the Rostern stockyards. She recorded the date of every breeding observation. She recorded the date of every calf drop. She recorded the birth weight and the sex and the condition of every calf born on the property from May of 1992 onward. The notebook filled up by October of 1992. She bought another one. The record-keeping was not a chore. It was the operation's circulatory system. Without it, she was guessing. With it, she knew. By the autumn of 1992, the first calf crop was weaned. 11 calves from 8 cows, a conception rate that Ida Sorensen, when Lavinia called to tell her, said was better than average for a first-year operation on new pasture. Lavinia sold 8 of the 11 calves at the Rostern stockyards in November of 1992 at $0 and $82 per pound on average, averaging 520 pounds per calf, for a total of approximately $3,400. It was not enough to cover her operating costs for the year. She had spent approximately $5,800 on feed, veterinary, and maintenance. She was running a deficit of approximately $2,400. She was not discouraged by this. She had projected a deficit in year 1. She had projected a smaller deficit in year 2. She had projected a small operating profit in year 3. But it was a dry July. She was tracking her own projections within the range she had estimated before she had started. The community in Hepburn, which was a community that paid attention to farming, the way communities everywhere paid attention to the primary industry that most of them depended on in some form, had formed a view of Lavinia's operation by the end of 1992 that was not hostile, but was not supportive either. It was the particular view that rural communities form about someone who is doing something unusual on a small scale. The view of patient skepticism. They were waiting to see whether the unusual thing would fail. In the ordinary way, unusual things failed, or whether it would succeed in the unusual way that would require them to reconsider their assumptions. Gordon Aldcroft heard about the cattle operation from a neighbor in the spring of 1992. He had remarried by then a woman named Cheryl who worked at the credit union in Hepburn and who had 2 children from her own previous marriage. Gordon was not unkind about the cattle operation when it came up in conversation. He said publicly, and with what seemed like genuine absence of malice, that he hoped it worked out for Lavinia. What he said privately to Cheryl on the evenings when the subject arose was more complicated. He had known Lavinia for 13 years. He knew that when she read something 3 times, she had decided to do it. He knew that when she walked a piece of ground alone, on a Sunday morning, she was not simply walking. He had known both of these things about her during their marriage, and he had not changed his assessment of them after the separation. He told Cheryl he thought there was a reasonable chance it worked. Cheryl, who did not know Lavinia, said that 80 acres didn't sound like enough. Gordon said he wasn't sure acreage was the point. The winter of 1992 to 1993 was long and cold. Lavinia spent it reading. She had ordered through the interlibrary loan system at the Hepburn Public Library every publication she could find from Agriculture, Canada, and the Saskatchewan government on rotational grazing management, Black Angus genetics, and wetland forage ecology. The librarian, a quiet woman named Harriet, who had been running the Hepburn branch for 22 years, had developed by the third order a general sense of what Lavinia was building, and had begun pulling relevant publications before Lavinia asked for them. They did not discuss this. The publications would simply appear on the hold shelf with Lavinia's name on them. By the spring of 1993, Lavinia had 14 cows on the property. She had retained 3 of her best 1992 heifer calves as breeding stock, and had purchased 3 additional cows from Ida Sorensen at the end of the previous summer, when Ida had reduced her herd size for her own operational reasons. The bull third had proven himself. His calves were heavy-boned and easy-fleshing, the kind of calves that buyers noticed. A cattle buyer from Saskatoon named Raymond Ouellet, who worked the Rostern stockyard circuit for a mid-sized packing operation, had taken note of Lavinia's calves at the November 1992 sale and had approached her afterward. He was 52. He had been buying cattle in central Saskatchewan for 23 years. He looked at people the way cattle buyers look at people, which is directly and without much social preamble, because cattle buyers are paid in to make accurate assessments quickly. "Those were good calves," he said. "Thank you. Who's your bull?" She told him about third. He nodded in the careful way of a man who is confirming something he had already guessed. "You're in Hepburn?" "Outside Hepburn. 80 acres. He looked at her for a moment. 80 acres is not much to work with. I'm aware of that. What's your expansion plan? She told him she was running rotational grazing on wetland native forage, that she intended to increase her cow herd to 25 over the next 3 years, and that she was selecting replacement heifers based on ease of calving and milk production rather than simply weaning weight. Raymond Ouellet listened to this with his arms folded. He had heard expansion plans from producers at every scale and in every situation. Most of them were optimistic in the way that people who have not yet run into their operational ceiling tend to be optimistic. This one was different. The woman was describing her operation in the language of someone who had already done the reading on every failure mode. He gave her his card. He told her that when she was ready to move finished animals directly, rather than calves, she should call him. He told her the premium for animals that graded well was substantially better than the calf market, and that her genetics, if they were what they appeared to be, would grade well. Lavinia put the card in her jacket pocket. She thanked him. She drove home. She did not call Raymond Ouellet for 18 months. She spent those 18 months developing the finishing capacity on the back quarter, rotating a portion of her steer calves through a small supplemental grain ration in the final 90 days before sale, a practice she had read about in an Agriculture Canada backgrounding guide and confirmed with Ida Sorensen, who had been finishing a small group of her own steers for local sale for several years. The grain ration was a manageable cost. The results on the carcass grade, when she tested the approach with 4 steers at the rostern sale in the spring of 1994, were better than she had expected. She called Raymond Uele in June of 1994. He drove out to Hepburn the following Tuesday. He found the operation in better condition than he had anticipated, which was not something he said to her, because he was not the kind of man who explained what he had anticipated. He walked the pasture. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the wetlands section, which was in full summer flush, and he stood at the edge of it for a moment without saying anything. "Mrs. Parrish," he said finally, "what are you doing with this land?" "The same thing the land has always been doing," Lavinia said. "I'm just working with it." He bought 14 steers for the September delivery. He offered $1.62 per pound on the hoof, which was $0.18 above what Lavinia had been receiving at the rostern sale. He told her if the animals graded the way he expected, he would be back in the spring and again the following autumn, and that he could likely move 50 head per year from her operation if she could produce them. Lavinia considered this. She thought about the 14 cows on the property. She thought about the 3 for calves. She thought about the 3 heifer calves she was retaining each year as replacements. She thought about the second 3-sided shelter she had been planning for the northwest corner of the upland section for the past winter. She thought about Rosalind, who was 15, Antang, and who could now run the morning check on the herd as well as Lavinia could, and who had quietly taken over the record-keeping in the blue hardcover notebooks without being asked, because Rosalind had seen that the records needed keeping and had gone to keep them the same way she had held the gate in May of 1991, without being asked to. She told Raymond Uele she would have 14 ready in September and could commit to 22 in the spring if he could confirm a price by February. He confirmed it in February. The September delivery was the one that began this account at the loading bay in Saskatoon, with the check for $23,800, and Dale, the receiving manager, noting on his clipboard that the animals came in above grade specification and that he wanted the producer's name for his supplier file. The community in Hepburn noticed the Saskatoon delivery, the way communities notice things that have been happening slowly and then suddenly appear as a fact. A neighbor named Walt, who had farmed grain on the concession east of Lavinia for 20 years and who had watched the cattle operation develop with the polite neutrality of a man who did not want to be wrong in either direction, stopped his truck on the gravel road one morning in October of 1994 when he saw Lavinia mending a fence line near the road allowance. "Heard you had a good delivery to Saskatoon," he said through the truck window. "It went well," she said. Walt looked at the pasture behind her. He looked at the wetland section, visible at the back of the property, which was in its autumn color, the sedge grass gone brown and gold in the October light. "What do you do with the wet ground in spring?" he said. "When it floods." She looked at him for a moment. "I wait," she said, "and then I rotate them in when the grass comes." Walt nodded slowly. He drove away. He did not stop to ask questions about the operation again, but he stopped, around that time, referring to the back quarter as the problem ground when it came up in conversation at the co-op elevator. He simply stopped using that phrase. Nobody who knew him noticed the change except his wife, who noticed everything. Sandra, the woman from the Agricultural Women's Network, who had told Lavinia in 1991 that the margins would be too tight, came to find Lavinia at the November 1994 network meeting and said, without preamble, that she had been wrong about the 80 acres. Sandra was the kind of woman who corrected her errors directly and without softening them, which Lavinia had always respected about her, even when the errors had been about Lavinia's own operation. "I thought you'd run out of land," Sandra said. "I didn't account for the wetland forage. I'd never seen it managed that way." "Most people hadn't," Lavinia said. Sandra asked her 2 or 3 questions about her rotation schedule. Lavinia answered them. They did not make a ceremony of the conversation. It was simply 2 women at a community meeting talking about grass and cattle and the particular properties of clay-based wetland in the 3rd week of November, which was the kind of conversation that most of the world would find unremarkable and that both of them found deeply interesting. Harris Coulter, the agricultural loans officer, who had approved $6,500 of the $9,000 Lavinia had requested in 1991, drove out to the back quarter on a Saturday morning in the spring of 1995 on the pretext of reviewing her account for a routine agricultural portfolio assessment. It was not routine. He had requested the visit himself. He walked the operation with her for an hour. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the notebooks, 3 of them now, filled with 4 years of daily observation. He looked at the wetland section. At the end of the walk, standing at the gate of the upland pasture, he said, "Mrs. Parrish, I want to apologize for the way I handled your initial application. In 1991, I approved less than you asked for because I did not believe the land could support what you were describing. I was using the wrong assessment criteria. The land productivity rating I was looking at was a grain yield rating. It had nothing to do with what you were doing with the land." Lavinia was quiet for a moment. The apology was accurate. She had known at the time that it was the wrong assessment criteria, and she had chosen not to say so in his office because she had needed the $6,500, and arguing with the loans officer was not going to get her the $60,500. She had simply made the operation work on what he had given her. "I know," she said. "It worked out. It worked out because of you," Harris said, "not because of the land rating or the loan amount." He drove back to Hepburn. He restructured her operating line at better terms that afternoon without her having to ask. He told no one about the Saturday morning visit. Gordon Aldcroft did not apologize in person. He was not by nature a man who drove to a property he had once owned to tell his former wife that he had misjudged it. He was a private person in the way that prairie grain farmers tend to be private, which means that his interior life was more active than his exterior one, and that most of what he felt about important things he expressed to no one except occasionally to himself. What he did in the winter of 1994 was drive slowly past the back quarter on the county road on a Sunday afternoon when he knew Lavinia would be inside and not at the fence line. He drove past, and he looked at the cattle in the upland pasture and at the wetland section behind them, which was frozen and white in the January light. He sat in his truck at the road allowance for several minutes. He thought about the Sunday morning walks he had taken on the property when he had owned it. He thought about how many times he had looked at the wetland section and seen a drainage problem. He had looked at the same ground as Lavinia and seen the opposite of what she had seen. And what she had seen had turned out to be correct. And the thing that stayed with him, sitting in the truck in January, was not the money or the operation or the Saskatoon delivery. It was the notebook. The blue hardcover notebook. He had never kept a record like that about anything. He had farmed 200 acres for 15 years, and he had never written down what he had observed on a Sunday morning walk. He drove home. He told Cheryl he thought the back quarter had turned out well for Lavinia. Cheryl agreed because she had heard about the Saskatoon delivery the way everyone in Hepburn had heard about it. Gordon did not say anything else about it. He went out to the shop after supper and worked on a hydraulic fitting for an hour, and then he came back inside, and the subject did not come up again. Lavinia Parrish ran the operation on the back quarter until 2018. By that year, she had expanded to a leased second parcel of 120 acres adjoining the original property, brought a second wetland section into rotational grazing, and was producing approximately 160 finished animals per year for Raymond Ouellet's distribution network, which had grown over 24 years into a mid-sized operation supplying 4 packing facilities across Saskatchewan and Alberta. Raymond had retired in 2009 and had handed the buyer relationship to his daughter, Simone Ouellet, who had continued the arrangement with Lavinia on the same terms her father had established, because quality was quality and the relationship had been working for 15 years by the time she inherited it. Rosalind, who was 39 in 2018, had taken over daily operations management in 2012 after completing a graduate degree in agricultural ecology at the University of Saskatchewan. She had written her master's thesis on native wetland forage management in prairie livestock systems. The case study in Chapter 4 of the thesis was the back quarter. Lavinia's name did not appear in the thesis because Lavinia had asked Rosalind not to use it. The case study was cited in the thesis simply as a southwestern Hepburn operation, established 1991, demonstrating the integration of natural wetland hydrology into rotational livestock management. 3 researchers in the Faculty of Agriculture had cited the thesis in their own subsequent work. None of them knew the woman they were indirectly citing walked the eastern edge of the wetlands section every morning at 6 o'clock with a cup of black coffee and a blue hardcover notebook. Lavinia was still walking it in the spring of 2024. She was 73. She walked slower than she had walked it in 1991. But she walked the same ground, and she looked at the same things, and she wrote in the same way in the notebook, though the notebooks were now stored in a wooden cabinet in the corner of the shelter. August had helped her build in the summer of 1991, and there were 31 of them. The lesson Lavinia had passed to Rosalind, and that Rosalind had been passing in her own way to the graduate students she supervised at the university, was not about cattle. It was not about wetland management or rotational grazing or the particular properties of clay-based native forage in a Saskatchewan spring. It was about the notebook. It was about the 6 o'clock walk. It was about the discipline of looking at the same ground every morning and writing down what you saw, which is the only way any farmer in any province has ever actually learned what a piece of land is capable of, and the only way anyone has ever learned anything that was worth knowing about something that was alive. The land did not need to be defended to Walt or Sandra or Harris Coulter or Gordon Aldcroft. The land defended itself in the only way land knows how to defend itself, which is slowly and continuously and over a long enough period of time that the people who doubted it are still around to see what it became. The grass grew, the cattle grazed, the notebooks filled. The wetland flooded every spring and receded every June and grew back taller than anyone who had never paid attention to it would have believed possible. And Lavinia Parrish walked the eastern edge of it every morning for 33 years, in the particular blue hour before the rest of Hepburn had finished its first cup of coffee, watching the same ground that everyone else in the district had looked at once and turned away from.